Well, good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the 2025 annual conference of SCETL's Civic Discourse Project entitled The Road to Lexington and Concord, Imperial Crisis and the Making of American Political Order, 1763-1775. This is the sixth event on our theme this year of sustaining American political order in theory and in practice. I'm William Anthony Hay. I'm the Associate Director for Public Programs and Professor here in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. This conference, again, is part of our series, the Civic Discourse Project, which is now in its 8th year. And we're very grateful to all of those who've supported us, certainly to our audience. Even with all of our fine speakers, we would not have a show without those to see it. And so I appreciate your attendance. We're happy, as always, to be collaborating with Arizona Public Broadcasting. Arizona PBS records all of our Civic Discourse Project events. Edited episodes are broadcast locally throughout the state of Arizona and posted on the Arizona PBS website archive. We encourage you to look on our archive at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership for a whole series of past events and past conferences for the CDP. You can find that, including lecture and dialogue events. Our website is SCETL, scetl.asu.edu. So check us out online. The larger theme for this year of sustaining American political order sets the conference topic in a much wider perspective. And behind many contentious debates today lies the challenge of upholding a legitimate political order that seems increasingly under strain. Without a legitimate political order, governments struggle to govern effectively. Now, the Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington noted that Americans tend to take political order for granted. It's already there. We don't have to worry about it. Americans focus more on economic development than political order because the United States inherited a complex set of practices, institutions, customs from Britain. And that spared the need to create from scratch many political institutions. This was not a de novo from a blank page, from a blank card project of making something entirely new. So exploring the emergence of American political order from the American Revolution 250 years ago, that leads us to a series of anniversaries that will unfold over the next few years. And these are milestones in the history of the United States. And so our conference this week on the road to Lexington and Concord explores the conflicts and traditions out of which American political order emerged. The famous shots fired in Massachusetts almost 250 years ago. Lexington and Concord happened a month from now, 250 years ago in March. Those turned a colonial protest into an open revolt that led to independence. And now, while most Americans in the 1760s celebrated, or early on celebrated ties with Britain after a shared triumph in the 7 Years' War, the relationship between colonists and the metropole and Britain soured over a series of new taxes, over a series of new regulations. John Adams, the famous patriot and second president, later observed that the American Revolution commenced well before the War for Independence. Adams located what he called the real revolution in, as he said, a radical change in the principles, sentiments, and views of the people. And so we will explore that over the coming day and a half. To open this morning, we are honored to have Professor Jeremy Black, Professor of Emeritus of History at the University of Exeter in England. After leaving Cambridge University with a starred first, he did graduate work at Oxford and then taught at Durham University in the north of England and then Exeter near the south coast until his retirement in 2020. Professor Black has written numerous, indeed very numerous works. His scholarship covers an impressive range of periods and topics, but his core specialties are 18th century Britain and the diplomatic and military history of Europe and the Atlantic world. His publications related to our theme this week include To Lose an Empire, British Strategy and Foreign Policy, 1758 to 1790, and how the Army made Britain a global power. In 2008, Professor Black won the Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize from the Society for American Military History. His talk today is Britain's Imperial Crisis, Imperial Overstretch, Accidental Failure, or both? Please join me in welcoming Jeremy Black.
Well, thank you very much. Nice to see also a number of friends here. What I want to try and do is not to read a script. I've sent one to Will. You'll be very welcome to ask him for a copy. And what's more interesting to me is the criticisms that you would have of it, because that would hopefully improve it. What I want to rather do is to talk around the topic. I'll start off with a personal reflection. 4 weeks ago, I had breakfast with a friend in a rather grand London house, his residence. And, he asked me what I was doing. And I know him because he's written as a hobby a number of thrillers, and I review detective novels and thrillers. And he, asked me what I was doing. And I said, well, it's 250th anniversary, isn't it? And he said, really? And then he thought, and he said, well, yes, I suppose so. The chap's name is Matt Palmer. He is the American chargé d'affaires in London, and in the absence of the new president appointing an ambassador, he is America's leading diplomat there. He's a very nice man, but I just thought that this captured a sense that we are the specialists. We actually are well aware of the basic argument. We know what's going on. We can debate nuances. We can debate new interpretations. The danger is that we don't always understand that the wider public doesn't quite see it the same way. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that the American Revolution is most understood at the present moment as a result of the musical Hamilton, which has played extensively both in New York and is still playing in London, far more understood in those terms than in any terms we would think about. So I want to actually try, from that context, not to get too involved in the specific details. I've written, I hope, those in the paper, and I would obviously be happy to discuss them. I want to rather point out some of the questions about the issue of imperial overreach, so-called, or accidental failure, and ask how far that is an accurate formulation and what relevance it has in the present day, a day in which obviously one can see incipient or actual imperial behaviour in a number of parts of the world. Now, overreach. The very term overreach carries with it the connotation that there was a correct reach, as it were. That empire, or indeed any other form of politics, is like an elastic band, that if you leave it in the correct form of tension, it will do fine. If you overstretch it, it will in fact either snap or be distorted out of shape or be unable to reconcile its differences. And Will, in his kind introduction, implied that in a way the 7 Years' War was a cause of overreach, that empire grew and that as a result of that, or linked to that, consequent upon it, of course the phrases one might use vary enormously, each with different explicit and implicit meanings, that the imperial relationship was put under enormous strain and indeed collapsed. And that is one way of looking at empires, or any other form of governance. But I think it's fairer to say that all forms of government, apart from utopian ones, or ones maybe of a household or an immediate community, inevitably have tension, and inevitably are in a process of both formation and dissolution. And when I use the term formation, one could actually change that slightly and add the term formulation. And that the formulation is related both to the supposed nature and purposes of the imperial or other governmental project, and in fact also to the way it implements itself. Now, from that perspective, in the 18th century, I'm going to come to Britain in a second, but in the 18th century, of course, there were a whole host of empires. In fact, I think it's fair to say that empire was the norm. This is something a lot of people find very difficult to accept, but empire was the norm across much of the world and for most of the world's population. It's a pre-census age, but insofar as the population estimates are of any particular value, roughly half the world's population lived in South and East Asia, and if you include Southeast and Southwest Asia, you'll be pushing up towards 2/3. Most of those people lived in imperial structures, whether you're thinking of Imperial China under the Manchu in this period, whether you're thinking of the declining empire of the Mughals in India, whether you're thinking of the post-Safavid imperial project in Persia, or whether you're thinking of the Ottoman Empire in Southwest Asia. If you also include the Spaniards and the Portuguese, you would actually find a significant portion of the world's population living in what one would clearly regard as empires, and indeed in what saw themselves as empires. The two are not necessarily coterminous. And as you will of course be well aware, and a number of people here have written eloquently upon it, Peter for example very successfully, there is the argument that of course in dissolving the imperial link between Britain and the 13 colonies, all one did was create a new republican empire in North America, one indeed that was in many respects far more effective and had far greater potential, at least as far as North America was concerned, than the British imperial rulers prior to that. And I think that's a reasonable point. There is no reason, sorry, I overused the word, but I'm tired. There is no way that one should necessarily assume that in rebelling against or dissolving an empire, or indeed any other form of governance, in terms of a language of liberty and a practice of difference, there is no reason to believe that that should not itself create an imperial structure. And if you think back to the republics of Europe, and the republics of Europe were, of course, a number of the American founding fathers were well aware of these republics. If you think back to the republics of Europe, Venice was experienced both in the Veneto by the cities that it conquered, places like Brescia and Bergamo. It was experienced in Dalmatia. It was experienced in further more easterly colonies in the Mediterranean, Cyprus until 1570, Crete until 1664. It was an imperial power. The fact that the Venetians didn't call themselves an imperial power didn't mean that they weren't functionally an imperial power, and in fact, in some respects, a model for the imperial practice of Republican America. You can pick an even better or clearer example if you were to think of the United Provinces, a federal structure which rose up in a valorous rebellion against Philip II of Spain, himself a great imperial figure. Under his rule, you get the first empire in the world on which the sun literally never set because of the Philippines, of course, named after him. But of course, the Dutch themselves became imperial powers, both at the expense of the Catholic, largely, people in the areas to the south of the United Provinces that they conquered, the so-called Generality lands, who were not brought under into the provincial structure of the United Provinces. Again, an interesting prefigurement of the American use of territories as opposed to states, but also, of course, as the Dutch operated as imperial powers elsewhere in the Caribbean, on the northern shore of South America, in southern Africa, and most clearly in the East Indies. So there is no reason to believe that one should be thinking of this period in terms of either empire as a redundant and overwrought, if not overreached, method, or one that is specific to and therefore can be clearly seen as obviously failing in the case of the British. That, of course, does not answer the question as to how we might envisage British imperial policy in the 1760s and early 1770s. The fact that there was empire widely elsewhere, the fact that there were clear parallels with British policy. John Eliot did a marvelous book on comparison of British policy and Spanish policy in the Americas. Charles III, of course, in the 1760s and 70s is trying to strengthen imperial authority in the Spanish Empire, including with governmental and fiscal changes. And he could have added, he didn't, but the same thing is true of the other major empire in the Americas, the Brazilian Empire of Portugal, which under the Marquis de Pombal, exactly in the same period that we're talking about, saw a much more what one might term mercantilist set of values. And of course, a key element of the American Revolution is that it's an anti-mercantilist revolution at a period when mercantilism of some form or other is actually more a matter of state policy than free trade theorists might like to think at the time or might like to envisage subsequently. So, obviously, Britain is part and parcel of a more general process. There's nothing unique or special about the British, whatever they might think about themselves as being in some way inheritors of an ancient Rome, which indeed was a general model thought of by most Western European commentators, whilst interestingly enough, if you're looking at the Russian Empire of the period, they saw themselves, of course, as the inheritors of the Eastern Roman model, Byzantium, the Christian power centre that had been based in Constantinople. But let's look at the British. And yes, I mean, clearly they had succeeded extraordinarily by their terms in the 7 Years' War, or as you would call it, the French and Indian War, and that this therefore might seem to have created an overwrought or overextended state in which the governmental problems create a search for solutions, fiscal solutions, which engenders opposition. Not just, of course, in the 13 colonies, but also, as Andrew O'Shaughnessy showed, in the West Indian colonies. And this produces, in some, though not all colonies, a eventual breakdown of authority and power leading to large-scale force. Yeah, we all know that. We can all discuss it. We can discuss the strengths and weaknesses of it. But let's try and focus a bit, because the assumption that is made when one is talking about that is in some way to consider the British as having clearly won and confidently won. To think of it as the year of victories, 1759, when, and as Horace Walpole famously said, the bells were worn out, proclaiming successive victories, or the second year of victories, 1762, when Britain prefigured America in 1898 in capturing both Havana and Manila. But of course, it's worth bearing in mind that this generation of policymakers and public had a much harsher, more difficult legacy to consider. Because if you're thinking about those people who were in charge in the 1760s and 1770s, from the sovereign, George III, born in 1738, as a relatively young man, to older figures such as Frederick Lord North, or, for example, Lord George Germain. They, of course, were all well aware of what I have called in one of my books the mid-18th century crisis. Britain in the mid-18th century had absolutely no confidence in the direction things were going. After all, if one puts aside for a minute the absolute terrifying situation on December the 4th, 1745, when Jacobite forces entered Derby, just over 100 miles from London, at the same time that the government was well aware that the French were preparing an expedition or invasion force near Boulogne. If one runs through from that, you will see protracted problems and anxieties in the 1740s and early and into the mid-1750s. These were both problems in the imperial periphery, if you wish to use that term. I think it's a pejorative term, but I can't think of a better one. Whether, for example, the repeated defeats at the hands of French and Native Americans in North America in 1754 to 57, for example, or if one thinks about problems closer to hand, the crisis of 1756, when Britain's alliance system collapsed, Austria going to her traditional ally, going off to ally with the French, when the British fleet was humiliated and in Admiral Byng's defeat, easier to produce an epithet of shooting admirals to encourage the others, but even that epithet was thanks to a Frenchman. Of course, Minorca was lost. There were big invasion anxieties in Britain itself in 56, 57, 58, and in 59 there was an invasion attempt which was stopped by the Royal Navy, 2 successive victories at Lagos on the coast of Portugal, not the Lagos in Nigeria, and in Quiberon Bay, but it had come very close to success, and the size of the French force was one that the British would have had no way of beating in battle unless one was living in a kind of world of Thermopylaean sort of conceit. So there was this protracted sense that things were anxious, were worrying. And they led, incidentally, as you would envisage and as you would expect, because you can think about the anxieties you see in the early American Republic about things going wrong. They led to debate. So the same sort of debate you're going to get in America about the relationship between regular troops and the militia and whether you should have a large militia was played out in Britain in 1756-57. Is this the only way we're going to be able to beat the other side? A very dominant political system, the system of the old core Whigs, the Pelhamites, run by the Duke of Newcastle, collapses in 1757, not because it's lost a single debate in the House of Commons, or for that matter, the House of Lords, but because there is a general sense that the political system has failed and that Britain is in grave trouble. So for a lot of contemporaries, and this in fact helps to explain the joy, if you like, there was a sense of complete amazement as to what happened in 59 and how this was turned over. I mean, as you may know, Britain's sole major ally was Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was fighting off the French, the Swedes, the Austrians, and most seriously the Russians. And of course, as you will know, the survival of Prussia was referred to by contemporaries at the time and has been referred to since as the miracle of Prussia. Well, in British terms, there was a miracle of Britain. The miracle of Prussia was in 1762, the miracle of Britain was in 1759. But looking forward into the 1760s, this did not create any sense of obvious security, superiority, or stability. In fact, far from it. Anxiety was written strongly in British public culture in the 1760s. And this anxiety helps very much to condition and affect the terms of public debate, including, I would argue, the public debate that washes around both sides of the Atlantic. And also, of course, it's worth bearing in mind when we talk about public debate, it's not just Britain and the 13 colonies. There is also public debate, including what contemporaries called patriotism, among the Protestant Irish, who have their own strong views of the constitutional relationship between the Dublin Parliament and the London Parliament. And that element tends to be underplayed by American and British scholars on the Anglo-American relationship. So what kind of factors can I think about if I want to talk to you about anxiety in the 1760s? Well, you won't be surprised, since much of my background is in international relations, that I would obviously focus first on the diplomatic situation. Well, we can call it diplomatic. It was in some respects the opposite of diplomacy. It was politics by megaphone, in a way that would be inconceivable in the much more advanced nature of the modern world. Now, if you're looking at this, you can see the way in which disputes over the implementation of the peace treaties are followed by renewed crises over the allocation of pieces of imperial territory, running right through the 1760s. Britain nearly has a significant outbreak of fighting with Spain in 66. There's the Corsica crisis with France in 68. There is the Falkland Islands near war with France and Spain in 1770. Those are the leading ones. I mean, if you're interested, I suppose the best book on the naval side, in which you can actually go through the naval armaments, the preparations for war, etc., would be the one by the Canadian scholar Nicholas Tracy. And he tends to underplay some of the seriousness of the situation in Europe, but he catches absolutely correctly the sense of the imminence of conflict in the Caribbean, or on the west coast of Africa, or in the Mediterranean. And in many senses, the Falkland crisis is the most problematic of all. The French and the Spaniards have been building up their navies anew. They have a combined naval strength that is greater than that of Britain. They are cooperating in a way that they had not done in the 7 Years' War until 1762. So the strategic environment, particularly in the Atlantic waters, is much more serious for Britain than hitherto. And in 1770, there is a row. The British settlement at Port Egmont in the Falkland Islands is seen by the Spaniards as an eruption into the Spanish sphere. Spain and Britain move close to war. France, under Choiseul, very, very hostile to Britain, comes down on the Spanish side. There is, of course, the family compact between the crowns of France and Spain. And Britain prepares for a war which it doesn't look in a great situation for. Remember, Britain doesn't have a single continental ally. The Anglo-Prussian alliance had collapsed in 1762, and that is a basic background to the strategic situation as far as our entire period is concerned. Indeed, if you wish to use the term imperial overreach, one might think that the imperial overreach is most pertinently used in the fact that Britain unusually didn't have a single ally, and that was very serious and was, of course, to affect it during the War of American Independence, but it also meant that it had to be entirely reliant on its own resources. Now, as you may know, in the case of the Falkland Islands near war in 1770, after everybody had mobilised, the French blinked, Choiseul is sacked by essentially his rivals do him down within the French ministry. What that leads to is Spain, having been sort of let down by the French, does a deal with the British. Both sides agree to leave the Falkland Islands unoccupied, sort of face-saving deal. But what this does is underline the extent to the British government about the need for preparation for war. Indeed, I think this is an important point. It is not primarily when one is talking about money in the imperial or indeed domestic relationships politically that one is talking about paying the debt off for the 7 Years' War. The debt is bearable. It's not pleasant, but it's bearable. The real problem is dealing with issues of current liquidity and creating the confidence that those issues of current liquidity could be settled and addressed so that one can continue to be credit-worthy and credit-ready. And neither of those are clear-cut for Britain throughout this period. Again, you might call that, if you like, imperial overreach. Again, you might point out that states often have credit problems. But the fact of the matter was that the succession of near wars helps to put this at the top of the government's agenda. And we play on. In 1772, Prussia, Austria, and Russia partitioned Poland. Unusually, the French foreign minister, the Marquis d'Aiglon, who'd replaced Choiseul, approaches Britain secretly to ask if the British and the French can cooperate in putting pressure on the partitioning powers, essentially to stop them going on doing this elsewhere. The British government is split about this, and it's only a certain number of ministers know about it. And indeed, I think, well, I've written about it, I think it's unlikely that they would have pushed it further. But in 72-3, the crisis spins in a new direction when Russia threatens to attack Sweden. Just to, complicate matters, the Swedish Age of Liberty comes to an end in 1772. Gustavus III overthrows the constitution. I mean, it's laughable to read the Declaration of Independence and to think what Jefferson would have made of a monarch like Gustavus, who really did want to do trouble and who really was a would-be tyrant. The Russians, who had relied on constitutional government in Sweden to keep Sweden weak, the Russians threaten war. The French decide to come in on the Swedish side. The British decide that they might have to fight the French and back the Russians. Again, after military preparations, it doesn't lead to a war. By the way, every so often people say to me, why didn't the British government pay more attention to what was going on in the 13 colonies? If you actually look at what was having to cross their desks, you will realise that that was not actually a very sensible way to think about things. And in fact, if I might briefly comment on that last point, one of the best political biographies of recent decades in Britain is Charles Moore's major work on Margaret Thatcher. And it's a very impressive work. He's incidentally a very nice man. But he gets it wrong. And the reason he gets it wrong, and I've told him this and he doesn't disagree with me, the reason he gets it wrong is, he was a contemporary of mine at university, I know him quite well. The reason he gets it wrong is he writes in sequential chapters about problems with the unions, problems in Northern Ireland, problems with foreign policy. Of course, it's not like that. If you're the Prime Minister or a senior minister, you're dealing with a vast mass of differing material that crosses your desk or is thrown in your face in meetings every single day. You can't say, right, chaps, we're going to spend the next week thinking about what we're going to do about the, let's say, if we're in 1772, thinking about what we're going to do about North America, because it just doesn't work like that. You've got at the same stage to be dealing with lots of other problems. And one of the difficulties is, in part, we over-intellectualize as a result what we call British policy, and the same with other states. Now, there are two different ways of looking at this, of course. There is a tendency among progressivist historians writing against a tradition of state building and in the 1960s and 70s to see Britain as a modern state. And you got that a bit with John Brewer, of course. You got that with Lawrence Stone of the Imperial state at war. It doesn't really describe the reality of these places. I mean, let me give you an example. Sir Robert Murray Keith, British ambassador in Vienna from 1772 to 1792. Very interesting commentator on the War of Independence, but we'll leave that to one side. His papers are in the British Library. Don't bother with the printed edition. They're incredibly limited in what of the ones that you should always look at the originals. Anyway, Murray Keith, in the mid-1780s, falls out with Francis, Marquis of Carmarthen, later 5th Duke of Leeds, who is the Foreign Secretary. The reason he falls out with him is because he has written 44 dispatches and not had a single answer. So he writes another dispatch, more or less saying, if anybody's out there is listening to me, what the hell do you want me to do? We are supposed to be trying to improve our diplomatic relations with Austria, which after all is a major power. Austria, just to remind you, ruled Belgium, the Austrian Netherlands. It was a major power in northern Italy, the Duchy of Milan, etc., etc. Well, you know this. So he writes this abusive letter, which is quite funny, and he gets back a letter saying that he must take this letter out of the sequence, in other words, renumber his dispatches from then. And he refuses, so he's recalled to London. He goes to the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office is part of the new modern British governmental system. 1782, they end the Secretary of State the Northern and Southern Department, and they create the Foreign Office and the Home Office. It's all new and sort of whiz-it and the sort of things Stone and Brewer were writing about. Well, he goes along. Weekday. He finds nobody in. Nobody in the building. The building is empty. Well, that might surprise you. But on the other hand, possibly it shouldn't surprise you. The entire staff of the Foreign Office, including the woman whose job it was to clean up, was 12. Of those 12, the Foreign Secretary was a womanizer and would-be poet. Sir James Bland Burgess, the leading Under-Secretary, was a Member of Parliament, principally busy in that front factor, and so on and so forth. The idea, in fact, that you have a modern, sophisticated governmental system is really not tremendously helpful. And that's not just true of the British. Think of the French. I don't know if you remember, if you were old enough to be taught how French history used to be, the idea that it was some kind of autocratic system of effective absolutism created under Louis XIV. You know, the intendant in the localities inflicting, as it were, royal injunctions and demands for funds on the locals. Well, come on. There were 33 intendants. They had an average staff of 12. How those were supposed to control 20 million plus, actually by the end of the century, nearly 30 million French people, is unclear. And as William Bike, the American scholar, showed in his excellent book on the intendant, the only intendant who actually were able to get their instructions fulfilled were those who told people to do what they wanted to hear anyway. In other words, who got on with the local elite. So what one has to think is not that government has a kind of bureaucratic system in which we are talking about defined policy. You have to think much more of inchoate things in which individuals, often manoeuvring in terms of their own particular views, inclinations, or economic interests, are seeking to exert influence on many people who simply don't know what's going on or don't always necessarily prioritize it. The first, of course, was satirized frequently. Tobias Smollett, for example, who, of course, was one of the great journalists of the age, writes about the Duke of Newcastle not having the faintest idea of the geography of Cape Breton Island and Nova Scotia when Britain is fighting there against the French. Or you have the problem, the Duke of Newcastle, again, great example of this. And of course, Newcastle for many years was, in theory, as Secretary of State for the Southern Department, in charge of whatever you mean by imperial policy, then going on to be First Lord of the Treasury, to have the same position, in theory, for 8 years. Newcastle, of course, regularly spent his summer going electioneering. He was a great boroughmonger. In fact, government as a whole generally packed up in the summer. Parliament itself usually only sat from January to May. You might sometimes have a quick session before Christmas. And when I say generally sat between January and May, the key business was usually done in January and early February, after which most MPs went home. They're not paid, of course. They want to go back to their estates. And most of the legislation in Parliament, as you will be aware, is not trying to implement some policy created by some ministry. Most legislation in Parliament is private acts, which in a sense provide the authority to impose costs for turnpikes, harbours and canal improvements. So what I am trying to argue is you have to be very cautious in assuming that there is a coherent process of policy decision-making which we can then castigate either to say that they got it right or they got it wrong. I think that's a very important point. And indeed, linked to that, one ought to be aware that the language that is used in documents of that period is the standard form of political language. It is rhetorical. It is determined in order to make points rather than necessarily being what we might consider, however one means by this, a more objective, free-floating, outside time and context account. And the rhetoric that is being used about imperial matters in the 1760s and early 1770s is much stronger coming from the American colonies than it is in the imperial metropole. The imperial metropole has got lots of problems. They doubtless get it wrong. They used to think of a modern term that's used to describe great powers and minor powers is the idea of sustainability, not sustainability in terms of have you got some green power plant, but sustainability in the terms of what is called resilience. How resilient is a state if it is going to fight? Now, in one respect, what the British are trying to do when they think about it in the 1760s and early 1770s is build up resilience for the next war with France and Spain. Understandably so. They're right, there is going to be one. They're right, they have very good spy networks. They're right, the last one went eventually well, but the early stages were disastrous and the previous one didn't go well. So you need resilience. Now, what resilience is going to mean is something that is much harder to determine. And it's there that politics comes into play, the politics of particular ideas, the politics of factional interest, the politics of personal, as it were, drives and such like. And that is complicated in the 1760s and early 70s because we go through a period, particularly in the 60s, of a change of frequent change of governments, which is rather reminiscent of Britain in the 20-teens and early 2020s. It only settles down a bit after 1770 as the North system is more stable and as North is able to deliver a victory in the general election of 1774. But that is all clear in retrospect. It wasn't clear in prospectus. It was not clear in prospectus that if Britain was going to get involved in another war, as it did unexpectedly in the 13 colonies, it was not clear that the country would be essentially domestically stable, which it was. The government then wins the 1780 general election and doesn't really have a serious political crisis till 82. It's not clear that it won't have to fight anybody else for a while, which is true. 75, 76, 77, first few months of 78, very unusual. Britain's not at war with anybody else. And indeed, you could argue, I would argue, that the only reason they're able to send so many troops to America in 76, because in 75 they hadn't expected trouble, is precisely because of the unexpected nature of the fact that the French at that stage are sitting on their hands, as are the Spaniards. So it is the unexpected nature that calls into question any attempt to say that X is overrated, overreached, overwrought, or whatever we want to say of the imperial project. It's very hard to do so because those appear clear-cut in retrospect. They would have appeared far less clear to contemporaries. Last point. I comment in my paper on Edward Gibbon. It's worth bearing in mind, interestingly enough, that of the great intellectuals of the age, Samuel Johnson wrote, of course, in the favour of Lord North's government over the Falkland Island crisis, and Gibbon wrote the Memoires Justificatives to try and persuade European opinion to back Britain on the war with the Americans, and of course Gibbon was a member of Parliament. I mention in that the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and of course that's a happy coincidence for an historian. That the British Empire was in trouble, it's a happy coincidence. But it's worth bearing in mind that people will often deploy in retrospect, or even at the time, examples that need to be used with enormous care. We've seen this most recently. I don't like making analogues to the present, but we've seen this most recently in talk about Munich and so on and so forth with reference to 1938. People use the past as building blocks for political debate. Munich, Suez, Vietnam, Iraq, and whatever else you would have said, and each generation has their own. They don't necessarily work, though, as operative, intelligent, contingently informed and contextually aware analysis. And we need to offer better if we want to try and understand the crisis of those years. Thank you very much. Now, not a single word of that was in my paper, so you can ask Will for a copy of that.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for a lively and a wide-ranging talk. I'm struck, both in your comments today and in much of your other work, you stress the point that we experience, we live life forward, but we understand in retrospect. And so we look at history and impose our understanding, knowing what would happen next. But of course, the protagonists in our story, or in the earlier story we studied, they had no idea what was next. And so to understand them, we have to keep always in mind their uncertainty. And I think that's a big theme that you raised, that the 1760s and early 1770s were an age of uncertainty, an era of uncertainty. And a point you brought up, and I'd like to see more of this, or ask you to say more about this. What works against resilience? I think that's a very important term you raised. The concern of the British state was to be resilient. And one could see in conflicts a pattern that Britain goes to war, Britain struggles to adapt to war, and then over time improves effectiveness and often usually wins. So that learning curve is a big part of the British experience, which sets a premium on resilience. So you can have a learning curve as opposed to lose right away. So Newcastle, you mentioned. I mean, fiscal capacity. Would you say more about the financial side of this and how keeping resilience, having a state with capacity, and the ability to finance that capacity, how did that shape debate and discussion in this period?
Thank you. Well, I think one of the points that I would make is that people in the 60s, and the major sources I'm using here are the, as it were, longer essays in newspapers, the more prominent speeches in Parliament, and private correspondence of leading figures. So that doesn't tell you about the bulk of the population, but those are the sources I'm using. People were uneasy as to the after effects of the failure of morale following the new reign. And the new reign starts with enormous enthusiasm. George III is seen as in a very, very positive light. His grandfather, George II, is regretted by virtually nobody, and there's enormous enthusiasm. And then politically, that runs into enormous difficulties by 62. The disgracing or falling or resignation, depending upon who you want to blame, of Pitt the Elder, the controversy around Bute, the beginning of the Wilkite controversies. There seems to be a collapse of morale in the metropolis. Interestingly enough, when George himself goes for the first major trip outside London, which is to Portsmouth in 1772, he and others are amazed at the enthusiasm of the public, not just in Portsmouth, which of course is a naval town and therefore would be atypical, but in the countryside as he goes backwards and forwards there. So one has to be very wary of assuming that metropolitan sources, London was only 10% of the population, engage and explain the rest of the country. But there is a sense that the political system has gone wrong. There is a sense that in international terms, things are going wrong because Britain doesn't have any allies. It makes sort of approaches to Russia and Austria. They get nowhere. There is this sense things are, and I think it's fair to say that the Stamp Act crisis, and indeed also the contemporaneous Cider Act crisis in England, both these crises lead to a wariness about what options the government has in order to deal with this. So there is, on the one hand, a belief that something should be done, which is always the most dangerous political ideas. There is that belief. There is a concern about whether people are becoming more decadent. Mm-hmm. There is this social language which is coming out now. We have no idea as to how far people actually believed this language, but certainly commentators, and this is before and separate to the India argument, the idea of great wealth from Indian acquisitions, meaning that empire is corrupting Britain. Separate to that is the argument that Britain itself is just becoming wealthier and is, as it were, if I like to think about this, sort of being corroded by sugar, in a sense, that in place of, the roast beef of old England and beer, people are now macaronis and dressing, which is a phrase for overdressed men. They're dressing up. There's concerns about effeminacy. There's all sorts of moral arguments about things going astray in the 1760s. Now, the king, of course, believes that really what people ought to do is be religious, be good, and, he's very much sees this. And as you may know, he subsequently is very big behind the manners and morals movement, but I think it's worth saying that this all is linked to a question of whether the people have failed to fulfill the potential of the past. And one last point here. In the Whig account, there is no national triumphalism. What there is a sense that Britain has moved outside the historical process, the established historical process in 1688 to 1689, thanks to the Glorious Revolution, but that could be sapped by corruption and failure. That had been a standard Whiggish critical line, which of course you see also in the 13 colonies. Now that line, which is essentially talking about domestic affairs, I'm arguing one also has to think about that as being pertinent to international affairs. That yes, Britain might appear to be the power that has, as it were, escaped history to become a great power and escaped the kind of cyclical motions that Gibbon writes about and that other historians write about, the idea of the rise and fall. But actually, there is always in there the latency of the fall, an idea which also has, of course, a religious connotation as well as a secular connotation, and that latency of the fall is an element that is playing out to some concerned commentators, not least the king.
Well, the question of public virtue and those who, specialists in the American founding, is a great concern about public virtue. Again, John Adams, I'm not setting myself up as a great Adams admirer or setting everything around Adams, but he's famously said, the American Constitution, this Constitution is for a virtuous and religious people. It will work for no other. And I paraphrase, but that concern with virtue, another American, so what you're pointing to is that concern with virtue in America is very much an issue within the British elite. Yes. And in British public culture.
I mean, give you an example with George III, one of his most astonishing reforms, which really flummoxes his ministers, is this. Under G1 and G2, essentially the ministers chose the bishops. Obviously the king signed off on it. And who did they choose? Well, what a surprise. Whigs and often relatives of theirs. G3 has the astonishing idea that he wants to appoint as bishops men of sort of known probity and known devotion. And he's got no interest in being told that X's brother will bring through. And this is a kind of really radical step. Yeah. I mean, there is a kind of moral rearmament from the king in some respects that reflects, but also it's worth bearing in mind that it's not just the king. I mean, what is the great movement here? Question time. As you know, I wrote a book on James Bond. Press the button. If you don't answer it, you get 3,000 volts as at the start of Thunderbolt. What actually Arizona State won't allow that. It'll just be like going to a Japanese loo or restroom. What is the great movement, the new movement of the mid-18th century in Britain? Well, and actually in the American colonies as well.
Methodism.
Methodism. It's not just the king who wants moral rearmament. Yeah. There is a widespread sense that things are going wrong. Methodism is far more successful than in terms of spanning the political world in Britain and the social world than the Wilkite movement.
Well, the Wilkite movement, I was thinking of Benjamin Franklin's observation about riots and how common riots were in England, and particularly in London.
Well, in London, of course, but across England as a whole, 1766, there's a whole host of riots. And in some respects, the reaction against the cider duty in England is much worse than the reaction against the Stamp Act in the 13 colonies.
So when you think of the Wilkesite movement, John Wilkes, the famous rake and politician who, seeking preferment himself, stirred up controversy and then caused a series of crises in Britain. The Wilkes crisis, the cider riots, and all of these series of protests, and then the American issues, foreign issues, you have this. You have just a pattern of very rough political weather.
Yes.
And in the 1760s, until you get to, as you point out, Lord North, you don't have any stable government. You have a series of short administrations. And so there's it's, as I say, very rough political weather. And if you think about the tyranny of the inbox, as we would say, those who are chained to email nowadays, this is we appreciate this. You're deluged with email to answer, and every email generates more. But the tyranny for the king, for ministers, the dispatch box, the box of papers sent to you to do your homework. And that was constantly a drumbeat. But as you say, there was no one thing. So it's hard to step back and be reflective or pursue a coherent line when you are continually reacting.
Yes, I would agree entirely.
And I'm struck, there's another figure, Charles Jenkinson, who becomes important later on, and his son later becomes Prime Minister as the Earl of Liverpool. But Jenkinson, who was a political friend of the king's and looked to the king for leadership, was very concerned about the idea of moral licentiousness in the 1760s, excuse me. So there's a concern that the moral order had somehow fallen apart, hence Methodism on one level, sort of an effort to have a method of piety, a method to go back to moral probity. Well, we have time for audience questions, for your chance to raise questions. We have the microphone set up here, so we encourage participation. If you have a question, please ask it, and if you have a speech, save it for another time. But please, we welcome questions from our audience.
You mentioned the general election of 1774 that was a victory for Lord North. To what extent, now let me step back, the First Continental Congress, of course, sends this address to the British people in October of 74, and my understanding is it arrives, of course, too late to have an influence on the 74 election. But am I correct in remembering that the general election was called a little earlier than had been expected? And if so, do you think it's possible that while before then the American colonists, people might have said to them, well, there's no coherent British policy here. It's just this, there's all sorts of crises going on. There's not a concerted effort against you. But after that election, which becomes a vindication of North, that's what persuades Americans in large part to say, no, at this point there's no hope for persuading Parliament to change its minds or persuade the British people to change Parliament's mind. And now there is a coherent policy that is never going to change. Do you think that's a possible? The reason why I ask that is because the general perspective is that the attitudes toward independence really began in January of 76. But to what extent do you think the general election influenced public opinion in that direction?
Right, well, thank you very much. First of all, it was under the Septennial Act of 1717, it was perfectly legal to hold elections early. All the Septennial Act said is an election had to be at least every 7 years or after the accession of a new monarch. So they'd already had this. So, for example, the election that was due in 1740, or by 1748, was held in 1747. You can do that. And it was always done essentially by the government, as is the pattern today, and the government calling an election when it thought there would be political advantage to it. So they weren't operating in any illegal or constitutionally invalid fashion. You ask a very good point about the 74 election and how it was perceived. What I would say is the 74 election was largely determined to try and validate the position of the government as a whole. As, you know, this is the government, we are now strong. It was rejecting the chaos of the 1760s. As you correctly say, it was seen because of the nature of the government's position on the acts going through or had gone through over New England, it was seen as by some as a validation of government policy in North America. I think it's worth bearing in mind, which it was and it wasn't, all right? Why do I say it wasn't? Well, of course, most seats weren't contested, and as you know, only a minority of seats were contested. And as you know, James Bradley wrote an excellent book on the petitioning movement and showed there were many Brits who actually were, didn't want, trouble, including some quite major figures. But it was in the sense that I think the Boston Tea Party in particular pushed against the boundaries of what was seen as politically acceptable. And it's worth bearing in mind that that's not just a case in Britain, it's also the case in the 13 colonies. There were quite a few patriots, subsequent patriots, who objected to the Boston Tea Party. And so I think, my own view is that George III got it wrong. I've argued that in my biography of the king. And I can understand why he took the policy he did. I think he made two major mistakes politically in his career, which is not bad by modern standards. That one and the one over Catholic emancipation, I think, were his two mistakes. It's quite easy to understand why he did these. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that yes, it is the North government, but it's very much George's government on most things. North is much more influential in fiscal policy. George is much more influential in, as it were, most of the rest, I think it's fair to say. As far as the Americans' patriot interest in independence, well, of course, some patriots were, but many Americans, including many patriots, and remember, patriotism was a term in political language, it's not just how we would use it later. Many patriots didn't want independence for a second. What they wanted was a different imperial relationship. And one of the difficulties here was they were feeling their way as well. Not just feeling their way towards what one might mean by independence, they're feeling their way towards a different imperial relationship. Now, you could argue that the British made a terrible mistake in not endorsing what we would subsequently have called Dominion status. And in fact, far from that being something that's a question of retrospective analysis, you see that in effect in what's offered by the Carlisle Commission in 1778. So it's not outside the political understanding of people at the time. Or you could have in fact said, well, let's let the American colonies have a kind of representative body which is as powerful as the Dublin Parliament. It's not impossible within the existing game box to have found things. So I think it's both a failure on the London side as well as a process of quite complex, which is why Americans do this marvellous work on the development of the ideas of independence, because it was a complex process of working out what to do. And the key thing is that the American Revolution is not like the October Revolution in 1917, a small, tiny cadre who terrorized the rest. It's actually, obviously there are many loyalists, but the American Revolution rests on a much broader basis of support, which itself therefore creates the problem of defining, formulating and ensuring and working through this support. But yeah, I don't disagree with you for a minute that the British made a whole host of moves which, shall we say, did not help Americans who were thinking through a way to reformulate empire in an acceptable fashion, which would have been much better for Britain, and much better, obviously, for in my view, for America, because to be spared a civil war, what it was, is not a brilliant thing.
Bringing up the Carlyle Commission, I think that's a very important point, because there's a conversation separately among scholars, but the concern that Congress had that Americans would take those terms. So for Congress feared that Americans would in 1778 think the Carlyle Commission was a peace offer during the American War of Independence by the British government after Saratoga. The British defeated Saratoga. This was people that Americans might well say, this is a pretty good deal, let's take it. And that would undermine Congress's position. But it's also interesting that many in Britain said, well, why didn't you offer this earlier?
Oh, and they were right.
Yeah.
They were absolutely right to say that. And very, very quickly, and then I'll take this gentleman's point, very, very quickly, on the Carlyle Commission, it's a classic example of the paths not taken.
Yeah.
And given that people didn't know what was going to happen, which was true both militarily and diplomatically, and given that it was pretty obvious that any war would have to end with some form of compromise, which indeed is what happened. It was just from the American point of view, they got a brilliant compromise. They didn't get Canada, but the British cleared out of New York, Charleston and Savannah, because the British got ultimately in '83 what they wanted from the Americans, which is the Americans ratted on their allies. France, Spain and the Dutch. So there was going to be a compromise, but nobody knew what compromise was going to be. Sorry, sir.
You alluded to your biography of your work on George III, which I'd recommend to everybody here if they haven't read it. But I was just curious, since you spoke of sort of George III and the efforts of his sort of efforts to revivify sort of morals in Britain. I was just wondering if you could speak to the group a little bit about sort of the political side of that. George III sort of taking power as sort of a patriot king that wants to sort of revivify British liberty, et cetera. So if you could talk about the implications of that to this sort of time period.
That's a really interesting question, because in a way, as you know, Thomas Jefferson meets George III in 1786, and it isn't a meeting of minds. But the interesting thing is, there is a similarity in many respects between the two men, not just in their personal interests in science. They're very educated and people, but also because they are both committed to what they understand as patriotism. George III believes very strongly, as a result not just of the influence of his father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, not just as a result of the readings that he had done, and he was very well read, but also as a result of the essays he'd written, which George III believed there was a corrupt political system in Britain, and that had to be improved, and the way to improve that is from as it were, the classical idea of a philosopher king. They called it a patriot king, but it's not a new idea. It's not that George III created this new idea. He believed that. And in a way, this again captures a similarity with those in the 13 colonies who are pressing also for a form of political improvement, moral rearmament, clarity of vision, and there is this pulse. I mean, it's not the case that this is just some sort of, as depicted in Hamilton, as sort of. Now, as we know, George also had personal failings in which, like many people who believe in being the philosopher king, he wasn't used to the idea that people would shout boo. He was so convinced of his own, moral virtue and purpose, with reason that he did have moral virtue and purpose, but he was so convinced that he didn't know how to cope with opposition. He really didn't. And as you will know, many Americans conceptualize George as a bad father. George himself was apt to conceptualize the American patriots as disobedient children. Now, in a sense, you know, that's very sad, isn't it? Because both sides meant well. There's no two ways about it. They meant well. And you end up the most appalling state of affairs. Which American patriot in 1773, 4 or 5 would have believed that it was really necessary to cooperate with France or Spain? Would have welcomed things like much of New York being burnt, you know? Just, you know, it was an appalling mess. Which Brit would have actually welcomed the idea of shooting, as it were, cousins, fellows fighting them in large numbers? It's a very tragic war. It's not as tragic on its scale as the Second American Civil War, the one that breaks out in 1861, but it is, you know, it's a civil war within the empire. It's tragic. Now, since the person who had most power in this context was George III, he bears, in my view, a proportionate role for the mistakes that were made. And I'm not trying to extenuate him when I try and explain him.
Question.
Professor Black, given your extensive work on British political history and cultural identity, how would you compare the British skepticism towards centralized authority, particularly in the context of historical parliamentary power struggles, with the American wariness of the federal power as described through states' rights movements? Are there any underlying cultural or historical parallels that influence these attitudes on both sides of the Atlantic? Put succinctly, how do British distrust of central authority and American states' rights skepticism compare? Are they rooted in the same historical DNA, or are they just distant cousins?
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, obviously, one's talking there about essentially a diachronic comparison, a comparison across time, which is always interesting. I mean, if you're looking at the specifically 18th century comparisons, I think it's fair to say that in Britain, although there was a standing army, there was really quite a lot of disquiet about a large standing army. The confidence is in the Navy. I think it's fair to say that that can be also seen in American concern about a large army and about what the powers of an army or a police force should be vis-a-vis the individual citizen. I think what I would say is that the British believed, and obviously we can put question marks against it and all the rest of it, the British believed very strongly in the idea that they were under the rule of law. They very strongly believed that. And I would say that's also a characteristic of American public culture. Now, what the law means in particular contexts and how it's implemented, therefore, varies enormously. But the idea that law rests in part on consent, that consent exercised through a jury system, was very important in both the British and the American model, and very different to, for example, the situation on the continent.
One of the points you made with regard to George III, and an interesting parallel, the desire for reform, the desire for improvement, moral revival, and on a separate line, the challenges of war, and as you put it, the need to build resilience, is another driver of change and of reform. But then reform efforts often bring on unrest or crisis. So when you start to change a system, that's the most vulnerable point in it. So it seems that the 60s and the early 1770s become a vulnerable moment for Britain, a moment of less resilience because of efforts to change the system, because of fears of virtue and decline. I'm struck, there's a book, Princeton University Press book entitled Fears of a Setting Sun. And the argument of the book, and the focus is on how many of the American founders, Washington, Hamilton, and Alexander Hamilton in particular, and some others, Jefferson later, feared that America was going into decline, that this great republic just launched was now heading towards the rocks. So how does that fit with the 1760s? Is there a concern that the world of rule Britannia is now moving towards the same kind of decline that afflicted Spain, that had afflicted Rome in Gibbon's take over a long period, or the Netherlands that...
Yes, I mean, and interestingly enough, if you're looking at other parallels, the Emperor Joseph II, so that's the ruler of the Austrian dominions in the 1780s, was a major reformer, and that ended up facing rebellions in the Austrian Netherlands and in Hungary. I think there's no doubt that if you change people's assumptions, then they are often going to react against it. There's no doubt about that. In terms of the specifics of Britain in the 1760s, it was, as you correctly said earlier, an astonishingly vexed and troubled few years. I mean, if you wind back, for example, I don't think you would describe 1751 as a particularly troubled year. No. If you wind back, I think you wouldn't really describe 1753 as a particularly troubled year. But gosh, the 1760s were really troubled in the most astonishing fashion. And there was this profound sense that, of dissolution. There was this really strong sense of dissolution. Now, ironically, this is all wrong, because ironically, forget about what might be happening in North America. Actually, the British population has started to take off. And industrialization is really picking up speed. The patents, I think the first year in which you get a marked increase in patents it's either 57 or 59. You're getting turnpikes being built, you're getting canals being built. Funnily enough, the actual economic fundamentals. I mean, it's rather like America in the 1890s, in which America is the strongest economy in the world. But if you were to read a lot of the stuff coming out from American critics of the 1790s, it's a terrible mess. So there is this irony here. But I suppose at the imperial side, what one might argue is, I put it in one of my books on empire, is empires always simultaneously are being made and unmade. The interesting point about the American empire, which was the most important outside Ireland in terms of the number of people living there who are represented through some sort of system or other, actually most of the inhabitants of the North American colonies, including those who were furious with government policy, wanted to stay part of the empire. It is not like what we would classically see as, for example, the anti-imperial reaction you get, say, against Spain in Mexico in 1821, or in Brazil in the mid-1820s against Portugal. It's not that at all. And from that point of view, it is really interesting if one's looking at the 13 colonies, which are mature in the sense that there are lots of people who are well-educated, able to think about ideas and articulate and thinking about ideas. It's really interesting that they don't conceptualize it for a long time, as is to be the case, as I mentioned, in Mexico, for example. And why that is something that's worth thinking about. I suppose one of the troubles, one of the difficulties, going back to what that gentleman mentioned, is the problem of actually creating a sense of America. Now, you have the Continental Congress, yes, but of course a lot of people don't particularly feel that. I mean, if you look at the history of the war, you look at the difficulties that George Washington encountered in persuading people to fight in the South in 1780 and 81. There is, and you look at the very different economic and contrasting economic, confessional and social composition between them. So, there are practical problems there. And I think that may be a delay factor, that there isn't already a strong sense of a separate America, cognate to that, for example, of Scotland at the time of the 45 or of Ireland at the time of the 98?
Getting back to a point that you had made to close our session, different steps, different moves would reset the conversation. So America forms, an idea of America forms out of these conflicts, out of these clashes, out of the eventual war for independence. And what was a viable option at one stage, for example, had North offered the Carlisle terms in 1776, is no longer as attractive.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And let me give you, looking a bit broader at the British imperial policy in North America. He's an American, but he works in Britain. The American scholar Geoffrey Plank has written about the influence of the Duke of Cumberland's clientele and imperial governance, particularly in Nova Scotia. And Cumberland, of course, was, just to remind you, Cumberland is George III's uncle. He's head of the armed forces until 1757. And he very much follows an attitude towards imperial governance in which you put in military figures as royal governors. And, you know, he likes to see that, as it were, stops. I mean, Cumberland falls in 57 because he fails to defend Hanover adequately against French invasion. And in a way, what's interesting is the autocratic potential of that imperial model is not followed through on. Sarah Kinkle, another very good American scholar, has written very well on the Navy, but the Navy doesn't have the practical interest in administering colonies that army figures do. And in a way, although it's very irritating to see troops on the streets of Boston, remember there isn't really a police force, there aren't many troops on the streets of any other colony.
Yeah.
I think that's worth thinking about.
Please join me in thanking Jeremy Black.
Thank you.